We are proud to present Dr. Ben Carson, Director of Pediatric Neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins Children's Center, a member of the President's Council on Bioethics, and co-founder of the Carson Scholars Fund, an organization whose stated goal is to provide a scholarship to at least one child in every school in the country. World-renowned for his expertise in separating twins conjoined at the head, Dr. Carson has been recognized by CNN and Time magazine as one of America's top 20 physicians and scientists, and is the recipient of numerous honors and awards, including more than 30 honorary doctorate degrees. Dr. Carson's speech is a powerful message of hope and possibility as he challenges us all to unleash the limitless potential that resides in each of us.
Thank you so much. It is so wonderful to be here with so many bright and enthusiastic people. And I'm always thrilled to be in the company of people with purpose in their lives. People like Sam and Linda, Dr. Reg and Joe, and so many of the people who really pour their hearts and souls into trying to make the environment better for other people. And I really think that that's what life should be all about. You know, money is fine, but it really doesn't amount to a hill of beans, to be honest with you. What really does mean a lot is if you can improve other people's lives. You know, when people feel good, they think good thoughts and they begin to do good things. And when you stop and you look at the life of Jesus Christ, you realize that he understood that, because every time he went someplace, what did he do? He healed people. And once he healed them physically, then they were ready to be healed mentally and spiritually. And I think that's one of the things that really caught my attention as a young person and helped me to formulate a dream of becoming a physician. Now, let me just briefly delve into how I became associated with the products of this company. You know, a couple of years ago, I was diagnosed with cancer. Now, I was an individual who got annual physical examinations and had my PSA checked and did all the things that I was supposed to do. And those things were normal. But I was noticing that when I was in the operating room for long periods of time, all of a sudden I was very interested in the clock. And I never used to be interested in the clock because I didn't have to go to the bathroom. I had a big bladder and it could accommodate me for days at a time if necessary. But now I was looking at that clock and I said, you know, this represents a change. So I went to see the chief of urology at Hopkins, Dr. Pat Walsh, and he said, you know, you probably have a little prostatitis. We'll give you some antibiotic. But the symptoms did not resolve. And he said, well, maybe you got a little focal hypertrophy, so we'll give you a little Flomax. But once again, the symptoms did not resolve. At which point he said, now what was your PSA? And he said, well, that's normal, but why don't we repeat it? I know it was just a few months ago, and we did, and this time it was slightly elevated. And he said, you're going to need to have a biopsy done. Now, if anyone ever told you that a prostate biopsy does not hurt, it doesn't hurt them. That's the part that they didn't tell you, okay? I must tell you, by the time they got to about the 8th or 9th specimen, I was just saying, you know, I don't really mind if I have cancer. But at any rate, you know, when we got finished, you know, I was told that at my age, the chances of me actually having cancer were less than 18%, so I really shouldn't spend a lot of time worrying about this. And I said, nevertheless, I'd like to know the minute you know something. So the next day while I was in the operating room, I get the call, and the nurse held the phone up to my ear, and I got the devastating news that not only did I have cancer, but I had a very high-grade malignant form. And of course, I put that out of my mind and finished the operation, but it really hit me as I was going home that I had a disease that could potentially kill me. I subsequently got an MRI done to see if there was any spread. And I remember coming out of the MRI machine, I was expecting one of the radiologists to be there to say to me, everything looks fine, nothing to worry about, but there was no radiologist. And as I was leaving, one of the technicians handed me a copy of my films. Now I was a little bit concerned. And I went up to my office and I put them up on the view box, and my heart sank as I saw all those lesions up and down my spine, and I said, no. I looked at the name on the scan to make sure it was mine, and it was. And I just sat down at my desk and just started thinking. And my senior PA came in, who's been with me my entire career, and she said, what did it show? And I said, it's over there on the view board. And she went over and looked and came back with the longest face imaginable, having seen the same thing that I saw. And interestingly enough, by the next day, information had already gotten out. There was a radio station announcing that I had a glioblastoma, a malignant cancer of the brain. And then I had colon cancer, I had liver cancer, I had kidney cancer, I had bone cancer, I had skin cancer, you name it, I had it. I was dying. I had died already. One lady called my office and she said, I heard Dr. Carson was dead. I want to speak to him, you know. So it was quite an interesting time. But because all of that news had gotten out, I started getting so many products from all over the world. People were sending me grasses and herbs and fruits and pills and teas and juices, and it was unbelievable. I mean, I could have started a store with all the stuff that people had given me. But one of the fathers of one of my patients asked me if I had ever heard anything about glyconutrients. And I said, well, you know, I've certainly heard the term, but I didn't know anything specific about them. And he gave me the website, and I subsequently contacted Dr. Reg, and we had quite a conversation about possibilities. And he sent me some product and prescribed a regimen. And I started taking the product, and within about 3 weeks, my symptoms went away. And I was really quite amazed. And I actually toyed with the ideal of not having surgery done, because it was recommended to me that I undergo surgery. And I was saying, well, if my symptoms went away in 3 weeks, maybe this could be controlled. And I started reading more about the theory behind it, the bolstering of the immune system. And of course, the immune system is the thing that detects and destroys cancers. We are all producing cancers all the time. But if we have healthy immune systems, they're able to identify and destroy them. And I was saying, you know, this makes an awful lot of sense. But then I began to realize that having a high profile, that if I did that, a lot of other people might follow that example too, but they may not be quite as diligent as I was about taking the product, and there would be a lot of needless deaths, and I didn't feel as though I could have that on my conscience. So I went ahead and had the surgery done. Now, interestingly enough, you know, I got, along with all the products, so many cards and so many letters from everybody imaginable, from the lowliest people you can imagine to members of the president's cabinet, senators, anchors of the major news broadcasts, President and Mrs. Bush. Everybody said they were praying for me. And I think the Lord just got tired of hearing about me because, you know, it turns out that the findings on the MRI represented a congenital anomaly of the bone marrow, and it wasn't metastatic cancer at all. And I was able to go ahead and have the surgery done by Dr. Walsh, who invented the nerve-sparing prostatectomy. It turns out the cancer was within 1 millimeter of breaking through, but it hadn't broken through and was able to be removed in its entirety. And I'm cured today. Now, some people have concluded that I was cured without surgery and that I was just cured by the glyconutrients. Maybe would have happened, maybe would not have. But, you know, I do not advocate abandoning traditional medical cures that have been shown to work. What I would, however, advocate is using natural products to supplement what's done by traditional medicine. The two things do not have to be adversarial. In fact, they can be really extremely complementary. Now, you know, that's the story of how I got involved. I'm not a Manatech associate. I don't think it would be appropriate for me to be one. I'm not a Manatech spokesman. I don't think that would be appropriate either. I do refer people to appropriate people. I do not make any claims of being an expert in the area of glyconutritionals. I don't plan to become an expert in that area because there are other people who are already extremely well versed in that area. So please don't tell people to call me to talk about this. It's amazing how many calls and emails and letters we get about this, just tons of them. And it's not appropriate. There are other people who are very good at this, but we are figuring out ways to channel those people without me actually having to spend any time involved in doing that. I still take the products today, every single day. My wife takes them too. You know, we're on the regular plan where we get our stuff every month. And for you to understand why, out of all the many, many products that I received when people thought I was going to die, why is it that this is the one that I chose to stick with? To understand that, you would have to understand a little bit about me and why I think the way I do. You know, I was always only interested in medicine. I used to listen to the mission stories in church and Sabbath school, and they frequently featured missionary doctors who seemed like the most noble people on the face of the earth, traveling all over the world to bring not only physical but mental and spiritual healing to people at great personal sacrifice. And it seemed like they were the most noble people on the face of the earth. And that, coupled with my readings of the life of Christ, made me decide that I wanted to be a missionary doctor. And that was my dream from the time I was 8 until I was 13. At which time, having grown up in dire poverty, I decided I'd rather be rich. So at that point, missionary doctor was out and psychiatrist was in. Now, I didn't know any psychiatrists, but on television they seemed very rich. You know, they drove Jaguars, had big fancy mansions, plush offices, and all they had to do was talk to crazy people all day. And it seemed like I was doing that anyway. So I said, you know, this is going to work out extremely well. I I was a local shrink in high school. I was reading Psychology Today. Everybody would bring me their problems, and I would sit there and say, I see. And, you know, I majored in psychology in college, and advanced psych in medical school, and I was all set. And I learned an awful lot of things when I was doing all of that. A lot of things about people and their personalities, and abnormal personalities and abnormal psychology. And I actually use it all the time now when I'm talking to people, when I'm analyzing people. It's actually sort of a side hobby of mine, analyzing people. And I'll tell you, there are a lot of crazy folk out there. Now, I said the word crazy. Some people get upset and they say, you can't use that term. That's politically incorrect. And, you know, people say that about all kinds of things now. You know, if one concerned themselves about everything that's going to offend someone today, you couldn't say anything because there's so many people walking around with chips on their shoulders. And it's not clear to me that anybody does themselves any favors by being so sensitive that they can't actually hear what somebody's talking about because they're so busy being offended by what they said. You know, that is not why God gave us complex brains. You know, it's only if you have a very simple, one-track mind, amoeba brain, that you're going to be offended by little silly things that don't mean anything. And I hope people know a little bit better than that. Well, you know, when I got to medical school, I started meeting a lot of psychiatrists, and I changed my mind about what I wanted to do. Now, this is not because psychiatrists are bad people. Some of my favorite people are psychiatrists. They're actually very good people in many cases. And some of the more intellectual members of the medical community. But what they do on television is considerably different than what they do in real life. What they do in real life is actually much more important than what they do on television. But it wasn't what I wanted to do. And I had to ask, what are you particularly gifted in? Do you have any special gifts and talents? You know, everybody has special gifts and talents. And I started analyzing my own life, and I said, what really unusual things have happened to you? Because usually those very unusual things have something to do with your gifts and talents. And I remembered that I became a foosball champion in college. Go off to a big, prestigious Ivy League school like Yale, but I remember being a foosball champion. That was a great thing. But that required a tremendous amount of eye-hand coordination. And I remember working one summer at a steel factory. And as a college student, they let me operate the crane. Now, these cranes are very complex. They had a whole bunch of levers that you had to push and pull because you were maneuvering these multi-ton steel packages through very narrow aisles and stacking them on the backs of trucks. And if you made even the slightest error, you could make a multiple $1,000 error. And these people trusted me, having never worked one of these things before, after seeing me play with it for just an hour or so. And I had that job for the whole summer. And I said, those people must have had a tremendous amount of confidence in me, a college student, who was the only college student working at the steel factory. So I started thinking, I want to do something that requires a lot of eye-hand coordination. And then I was also a very careful person. I never knocked things over and said, oops, which is a great characteristic for a neurosurgeon, I got to tell you. And I had the ability to think in 3 dimensions. You know, most people think in 2 dimensions, but to think in 3 dimensions, to be able to keep your spatial orientation, very, very important if you're in somebody's brain, because it's just like mush. It's just a big pile of mush. And it doesn't have a lot of structures in it to tell you where you are. So if you can't keep in mind where all the little nuclei and tracks and things are, all of your patients will come out looking like that. So you don't necessarily want to do that either. And then I love to dissect things. I always love to dissect things. You know, when I was a kid and I would be sitting at the table eating, and I would have my fork and my knife out, dissecting out all the little neurovascular bundles out of the meat and putting that in a pile. And my mother would be saying, "You can't eat with us. You go sit on the landing." But, and I always, if there was a little bug around or a little rodent or something that I could catch, I always knew what was inside. I love to dissect things. So I put all that together, and I said, "You'd be a terrific neurosurgeon." Now, you know, doesn't mean that I couldn't have been a good dentist or a history professor or even, God forbid, a lawyer. But I probably would not have been excelling to the same degree because I wouldn't have taken advantage of the special gifts and talents that God had provided. And you know, I think God provides everybody with special gifts and talents. It's very important to get in contact with what they are. Well, there were a lot of bumps along the road on the way to, you know, realizing my dream of becoming a doctor. Of course, my parents got divorced early on. That was devastating. You know, my mother was a person with only a third-grade education. She was one of 24 children, had gotten married at age 13. And, you know, after the divorce, you know, we were thrown into a situation of dire poverty. My father had been a factory worker, and, you know, they made at least a reasonable salary, and my mother was a very prudent person, and she would take, you know, the money that he made and, you know, pay the bills, and she would always put aside some, and over the course of the years, they accumulated a fair amount of money and were able to buy several pieces of real estate. And I actually believe that if my father had been smart enough to listen to my mother, that they would have become very wealthy people. And she only had a third-grade education, but she had a lot of wisdom. But unfortunately, he didn't listen. He got involved with drugs and other things. He, you know, basically wasted all of the money. They lost all of the property. And then she found out he was a bigamist on top of that. So that was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. And she took us after the divorce, and we moved to Boston to live with her older sister and brother-in-law in a very typical tenement, large boarded up multifamily dwellings, rats, roaches, sirens, gangs. I remember one of our favorite people was a guy named Benny Boston Bowers. He always had three-piece suits and drove a Cadillac and brought candy for the kids. It turns out he was a drug dealer, as were so many of the people around. And I remember the day he was killed. And both of my cousins that we lived with were killed. It was a very, very violent environment. I never expected to live to be more than 25 years of age. And it just seemed to be the way that things were done in those days. But there was just so much poverty. My mother worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs at a time as a domestic, cleaning other people's houses. She didn't want to be on welfare. She figured if she did that, she would lose control of her life, and she would lose control of our lives. And she didn't want to be in that particular situation. But I remember one thing about myself in particular. I hated poverty. You know, it doesn't bother some people. Some people are just happy to sit around doing nothing and, you know, maybe get some booze to drink and just have something over their head, and, you know, they can be happy as a pig in slop. But, you know, I hated it. I just didn't like it. And it's not that I really had known anything tremendously different from it, but there was just something inside of me that didn't like it. And in a way, I think maybe that was a good thing, because it drove me at times when I might have been willing to give up. It drove me to continue on, because I didn't want to go back there. I didn't want to fall into that lifestyle of what sometimes seemed to be helplessness. But I wasn't a very good student. And I remember one day I was sitting in class, and the teacher was talking about some European history, and the other kids seemed to know what was going on, and I knew absolutely nothing. And the same thing seemed to be happening in mathematics and in English. And there was a sudden panic that gripped me as I began to realize that I was a dummy, that I didn't know anything, that I was stupider than everybody else. I used to realize that I was stupid, but I didn't think I was stupider than everybody. And now I was starting to really think that this might have some impact upon me. And then the other students began to seize upon it also, and to realize how stupid I was. And I tried to pretend like I didn't care. I adopted that attitude. And it became more than just an attitude. Pretty soon, it began to eat away at the core of me. And pretty soon I didn't care, because I began to think that I wasn't going to escape poverty, that things never were going to be particularly good for me. I started to give up. And I started noticing that I would do things that were dangerous, you know, like hopping trains to get to different places, even after a friend of mine got his leg cut off doing that. If the train was going slowly, we would actually go under the train to get to the other side and not really worry about that. We would climb fences of junkyards while somebody else was distracting the mean junkyard dog, and we'd go and stand in the middle of the junkyard, and then we'd say, "Hey, dog," and then we would see if we could get out before the dog caught us. You know, I mean, it was pretty stupid stuff. It was really, really dangerous stuff, and it makes my heart shudder when I think about doing stuff like that. But I was a risk taker as a youngster. And I'm still a risk taker even now. You know, there aren't people who take a lot more risks than neurosurgeons. But now I take the risks not because I don't care. I take them now because I do care. Because I do want to give people longevity and quality of life. And I think that's the thing that drives most people who are in my profession. Unfortunately, you know, we are in the process right now of losing more neurosurgeons per year than we are able to train. They're retiring at very fast rates. And there are many parts of the country now where there aren't any practicing neurosurgeons. There are many parts of the country now where if you're driving in your car and you have a bad accident, you have a subdural hematoma, you're dead. There's not going to be anybody around who's going to take it out. And it's really a very sad situation that has arisen, part of the state of medicine today, because the average premiums that neurosurgeons have to pay are so high. In places like Philadelphia, it's $300,000 a year if you've never had a lawsuit. And that is really untenable when you couple it with the fact that there is no floor to the limitation of funding from insurance companies, and there's no ceiling for the amount of malpractice premium you have to pay, and people get squeezed. And so now the average age of retirement for a neurosurgeon is 55, right at the time when they should be in their prime. And you look at obstetricians, another area being decimated. Many obstetricians now quit delivering babies 18 years before they plan to retire because they have to carry that malpractice tail for 18 years beyond the last baby that they delivered. There's nothing else in our society that carries an 18-year guarantee except a baby. And, you know, it's really pretty absurd. And I'm very hopeful that the American people will recognize how much havoc all the litigation is wreaking on our society. You know, a number of years ago, I went back to my grade school. I went back to my grade school with Good Morning America. They wanted to sort of trace the roots of how I had grown up, and I was so excited about the science lab. And Mr. Jake, my 5th grade science teacher, who was one of the first people who believed in me, and he was still there, believe it or not, 30 years later, you know. No longer the dapper, dashing, young, recent college graduate. Now his head was bald and he had a big pot belly. But, you know, he was still Mr. Jake, the good science teacher. And I said, can you show them the science lab? Show them the red squirrel and crawfish, and, you know, we had Jack Dempsey fish, and there was a tarantula, and there was so many neat things that would get a young person just so excited about the animal kingdom and about science in general. And he said, we don't have any of those things anymore. We can't have any of those things anymore because of the potential for a lawsuit. And I said, but what about all those kids who could be inspired? They have to be inspired by pictures and books. You know, and it's really a very, very sad state of affairs when people feel that everything has to be litigated. Now, I don't want anybody to go out of here thinking that lawyers are bad people. Lawyers litigate. That's what they learn how to do. And for everyone who goes around doing that, there's another one on the other side who's protecting us. So we have to recognize that at least 50% of lawyers are good people. Nevertheless, what do lawyers do? They like to argue. That's what they're taught to do. You got to argue your point of view effectively. You got to use every tool you'll have. Doesn't matter whether your client is right or wrong. And what do we have in our Congress? Lawyers, mostly. Wasn't supposed to be that way, by the way. If you go back and you look at the way it was supposed to be farmers and pharmacists and teachers and doctors and all kinds of people, because they were supposed to be representative of the people. And as such, their interest would be in the whole community rather than winning their point of view. And of course, we have Democrat lawyers who think the Democrat way has to be proven right, and we have Republican lawyers who think the Republican way has to be right, and nobody seems to give a care about what is really right. And that's the problem that we're having in our nation right now. We need to fix it. So I hope that many of you will go out there and become candidates. You know, those of you who aren't lawyers, by the way, will go out there and become candidates so that we can begin to change this. Because, you know, I want lawyers to be there too, but I want there to be everybody else there too, so that we can begin to think as people, not about just winning a point of view, but about winning for our nation. That's what's going to make the difference in the long run. Well, you know, fortunately for me, you know, there I was, just a terrible student, but my mother, who had only a 3rd grade education, worked as a domestic in other people's houses, and she wasn't just working there, she was observing She was always looking at what they were doing and how they were spending their time. And she would come back and she would say, rich people don't sit around looking at TV all day. And they strategize and they plan and they don't waste a lot of time. And she was always drilling this into us. But at one point she became so convicted because both my brother and I were doing so poorly, and she just prayed. And she said, Lord, you got to show me what I can do to help them to get on the right pathway. And you know, that's the wonderful thing about the Lord. You don't have to have a PhD to talk to him. You just have to have faith. Third grade education was fun, you know? Because she believed that the Lord would answer her prayer. And in fact, he did. He gave her the wisdom. At least in her opinion. My brother and I didn't think it was all that wise. I mean, turning off the TV set, what kind of wisdom is that, you know? As far as we were concerned, it was child abuse. But, you know, not only did we have to turn the TV off, but we had to read books and submit to her written book reports, which she couldn't read, but we didn't know that. You know, she would put little check marks on it and be underlining things and asking us about it and then discussing it with us as she took cues from what we were saying. But, you know, the interesting thing about reading, if you're looking at words all the time, you learn how to spell. All of a sudden, I wasn't the first one to sit down in the spelling bee. And you're putting those words together, so you learn grammar and syntax. And now when you write your essays, it doesn't come back full of red marks. And because you have to take those sentences and make them into concepts, you learn how to use your imagination. And there are so many incredible benefits that derive from reading. Now, because it did so much for me, you know, I went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class within the space of a year and a half from reading those books and from learning new and different things. And my brother also made a similar transition. And I remember there was one kid, his name was Steve. You know, he used to be the smartest kid in the class. And he really would rub it in on you. I mean, he would make you feel so stupid. And he would always bring his A and he would shove it right in your face. And he would say, "What's wrong with you? Are you retarded?" You know, he was just a really mean guy. And I remember after I turned things around, I went up to Steve and I said, "Hey, Steve, how'd you do in the exam?" And he poked out his chest. He said, "Oh, I got a 91. I said, "Well, gee, that's too bad." "Oh, I got 100. And I said, "Next time if you need help, let me know." You know, but that was probably a little mean of me. But, you know, realizing how much reading had done for me, you know, in our scholarship program, one of the things that we've done is to create a reading program where we put these special Think Big reading rooms in schools. And we make it a very, very pleasant and friendly environment for the kids to come in. And then the kids actually get rewards for reading books. They get certain points, just like the old S&H Green Stamp program. And when they accumulate a certain number of points, they can trade it in for a Walkman or, you know, a book or whatever it is that they want to trade it in for. And the kids are very, very enthusiastic about this program. And the interesting thing is, once you can get a kid starting to read at a young age and get interested in it, it's something that they continue to do for the rest of their lives, and it makes a huge difference. And that's one of the reasons that we've gotten so enthusiastic about that particular program. But also, our scholarship program in general, it's something that I'm very, very passionate about. And why am I so passionate about it? Because when I look out there on the landscape, I recognize that we are now in a technological age. The thing that will allow this nation to remain in a leadership role is knowledge, having a lot of technological knowledge. And, you know, we have a lot of knowledge about sports and entertainment, but that's not going to get us very far. You know, that's what other pinnacle nations had before their fall. They got to a level of greatness, and then they got enamored of sports and entertainment, lifestyles of the rich and famous. They lost their moral compass, and they went right down the tubes. And I think that we cannot go down that same pathway. We must not go down that same pathway. But the way that we keep from going down that pathway is we change the attitude of our young people. So my wife and I started giving out scholarships, $1,000 scholarships to students starting in the 4th grade for superior academic performance, because we noticed that in the schools, all the big things went to the all-state basketball player or the all-state wrestler or the quarterback, and the superstar in academics got a pat on the head and a National Honor Society pin. And they were nerds and geeks and Poindexters. And we said, we've got to change that. Now, I'll tell you something. If you give a 4th grader or a 5th grader or a 6th grader $1,000, they automatically become big men on campus. Let me tell you, people stand up and they take notice of that. And they want to know, how did you get that? And what can I do to get that? And they start trying and striving. And we have seen enormous progress in the school system, in various school systems in doing that. And some of the students get so enthusiastic about it. There was one school in Maryland, the Magathy Middle School, the kids themselves, they sold dinners, they washed cars, they did whatever they needed to do. They raised $16,000 so that they could endow their own school with scholarship programs so that it would generate a new scholarship each year. They're in the process of endowing a second scholarship now. The kids did this on their own. It gives you some idea of what kind of young people we have out there. And we now have about 1,300 scholars in 9 different states. And the state of Delaware recently, get this, the legislature of the state of Delaware voted unanimously, Democrats and Republicans, unanimous, this is historic, to give $500,000 to the scholarship program to begin endowing every school in Delaware with a Carson scholar. And that is an amazing thing. So, but more importantly than just the fact that these kids are very, very smart is the fact that these kids, in order to win, have to demonstrate humanitarian qualities. They have to demonstrate that they care about other people. And this is so critical in our world today. You know, we live in a world today where we actually have people who believe that it's okay for somebody to be brutalizing somebody else or doing some horrible thing to a group of people as long as they're not bothering them. And you know, this is the philosophy that allows brutal dictators to rise in a modern world. And I can't believe that I hear people saying that we should have left somebody like Saddam Hussein alone and let him go ahead and brutalize people as long as he's not bothering us. Whatever happened to humanitarian qualities? You know? And I hope that we can raise a generation of young people who don't just turn a deaf ear or a blind eye when they see injustice going on in their community, and their community includes the entire world. And I think we all have a sphere of influence. And what we do with that sphere of influence will determine what happens in the next generation. And if we use it in the right way, I don't think that we have to go down that same path that all those other nations have gone down before. We do not have to give up our values. We do not have to give up our principles and those things that we stand for. and we can instill those in our young people. And we, when we retire, when we become old people, will not have to worry about what's going on out there. But we hold the keys to doing that, and we must begin to emphasize the right things now and not allow Hollywood to dictate who we are. Well, fortunately for me, you know, I got on the right track academically. But, you know, I went a little overboard. I got to the point where an A wasn't good enough. You know, if I got a 99 on a test and somebody else got 100, I was devastated. I mean, I couldn't live with myself until the next test when I could get a higher score than they did. And that was a miserable way to live your life. And I remember I walked up to one of my classmates in the 9th grade and I said, "Dennis, why do you hate me so much?" And he looked me dead in the eye and he said, "It's because you're so obnoxious." And I said, "Obnoxious, moi?" He said, "You always have to have the highest score on everything." And I knew he had told the truth. It was like someone had stabbed me in the heart with a dagger. And I started thinking about that. And I started thinking about how miserable I was making myself. And I decided from that point on that I really didn't care. I didn't even want to see what anybody else got on their paper. I was only going to worry about what I was getting. I was going to do the best that I could. And you know, once I started worrying about only doing the best that I could, it was like somebody had lifted a gigantic weight from my shoulders. And I was actually able to do even better than I had been doing when I was trying to compare myself with other people. And you know, how many people make their own lives miserable by worrying about what somebody else is doing, what somebody else is accomplishing, and trying to get ahead of that other person? You know, materialism is like that. The love of money, greed, is a horrible thing. Now, I'm not saying that people shouldn't make a good living, but when people make a living, it should be a byproduct of utilizing the talent that God has given them to make the environment better for the people around them. And that's when you begin to have true fulfillment in your life. And I think you find that whether you do something else and you're a Manatech associate as a hobby, or whether that is your full life's work, that there are so many better things to think about than making money. Think about how you can actually use a product to improve people's lives. And when you think about it that way, it comes through loud and clear to people when you're talking to them. Now, the medical community is a particularly difficult group to get through to. It's because when you're talking about nutrition, you're talking a foreign language to them. Because doctors don't learn about nutrition, for the most part, in medical school. But doctors are not the problem. Doctors are generally very, very interested in anything that's going to make their patients better. And they are not the problem. It's the establishment, the medical establishment, not the doctors themselves, who tend, I think, sometimes to like to maintain the status quo. Because if everybody were well, then they would be out of business. And they don't want to be out of business. Doctors would love to be out of business, but they know that there's always going to be plenty of sickness to go around. So you're not going to generally find individual physicians who are trying to suppress something that is doing good. Doctors do have a tendency, because of their training, however, to want to see data. They want to see the double-blind prospective study that was carefully designed, that has a statistically significant variation that they can sink their teeth into and say that this works better than this. And I think that that's one of the projects that this company is in the process of working on. And I'll tell you, once that happens, it is going to be phenomenal. You think things are great now. Once the medical community is able to see the benefit of what is going on, it's going to be phenomenal. Because think about this. God provided in our diets everything that we needed to keep our bodies healthy. You know, the immune system absolutely has to have the right building blocks in order to work. The reparative processes of our bodies, like you scrape your skin, do you notice how quickly that heals? You get a corneal abrasion, how quickly that heals? Because of the way the reparative process comes in and starts working so rapidly. That has to have the right fundamental structure beneath it, the correct nutritional structure beneath it. And if you go to somebody who is malnourished and you put a scratch on their skin, it doesn't heal. You scratch their eye, it doesn't heal. It festers, it becomes infected, bad things begin to happen. So it tells you how important that nutritional status is, and God provided that for us. However, we have become so incredibly sophisticated that we process our foods to the nth degree, and we manage to get all of that good stuff out of them. And then consequently, we think we're eating well, and we're certainly getting plenty of calories out of it, and we're getting very fat, but being fat is not equivalent to being well nourished. And what we have to do is begin to educate people about how you put the building blocks back into their diet. Now, the ideal thing would be for all of us to go back to the Garden of Eden. We wouldn't need glyconutritionals. We wouldn't need anything. All we have to do is eat the wonderful fruits and vegetables that God provided for us. That's not practical because the Garden of Eden is no longer here. Well, the next best thing is maybe if we could all have a fresh, organic diet, and we could drink 6 to 8 glasses of pure water every day, and we could exercise regularly, and we could get plenty of rest, and we could take the stress out of our lives, then we could also be very healthy. But how many of us are going to do that? So given the fact that, we're relatively lazy, and we live in a modern world, now we got to ask ourselves, what can we do to get as close to that natural diet as possible? And that's where nutrition comes in. And that's where finding the right kinds of supplementary products comes in. And you can do your own research in terms of which products are the best. But as I looked around, with all the various things that I had access to, you can see where I'm standing tonight. Well, getting back to what kind of person I am, you would have thought that having gotten everything together academically, I was going to be on the road to complete success. But I had another problem. I was an angry person. I had a terrible temper. People could make me angry so easily by saying something to me, by doing something to me, by taking something of mine, by getting in front of me when I thought I should have been in a certain position. Notice the common theme there. Me, 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 me. And that's the common theme in people who have bad tempers. Meism. They're always concerned about me. And it reached the point where one day another teenager angered me, and I took a large camping knife and I tried to stab him with it. And fortunately, he had on a large metal belt buckle under his clothing, and the knife blade struck it with such force that it broke. And of course, he fled in terror, but I was more terrified than he, as I recognized that there I was trying to kill somebody over nothing. You know, I've always had this thing for knives. You know, I was fascinated with knives. You know? But you know, no matter what it is, you can always turn it around and make it into something positive, can't you? You absolutely can. Well, you know, I locked myself in the bathroom that day and I started thinking about knives. But then I started thinking about where they were going to take me. Where was this temper going to take me? It wasn't going to take me to my dream of becoming a physician. It was going to land me in jail or reform school or the grave. And none of those appeared to be very good options for me. You should beware of the fact that the county reform school in Wayne County, which is the county that Detroit is in, their educational program is called the Carson program. I want you to know that. I guess that's an honor when they name the reform school after you. Huh? But, you know, as I was contemplating that, I just realized that the temper was not going to get me where I wanted to go. And I fell on my knees and I just prayed and I said, Lord, I can't control this. I've tried. By that time, you know, I was already reading Psychology Today. I was already learning about personality disorders and behavior disturbances, and I knew that I had one. And I was reading about behavioral modification techniques, and I knew that they cost a lot of money. I knew I didn't have enough money to go to a psychotherapist. We didn't have any money for anything. And I said, Lord, you're going to have to be my psychotherapist because I can't go on like this. And I just turned it over to him. And I said, if you want me to do something in life, you're going to have to fix this. If not, you know, I'll just go on like this. But I'll tell you right now, I can't do it. And I picked up my Bible and it opened to the book of Proverbs and I started reading. There were so many verses in that book about anger and the trouble that you get in when you manifest that anger. But there are also verses like Proverbs 16:32 that says, mightier is the person who can control their anger than the person who can conquer a city. And it seems like they were all written for me, and I stayed in that bathroom for 3 hours reading and praying and contemplating. And when I came out, the temper was gone, and I've never had another problem with it since that day. And you know, I adopted God that day not only as my heavenly Father, but as my earthly Father, as somebody that I could go to with problems, somebody who would give me wisdom and help me to find my way through the quagmire of life. And I discovered another thing about God. I used to have this concept of God as being a very stern old man with a long white beard and a long telescope who was always peering down through the clouds to see what you did wrong so to make sure you got punished for it. Now, where did I get a concept like that? Church. In the church. You know, if there are any ministers out there, don't tell the kids stuff like that. Because that's not the way God is. He really is not like that. You know, he was the guy who gave up everything for us, you know? And we got to stop portraying him as this ogre because, you know, the guy will do anything for you. He loves you. And, you know, he gave his own son for you. So anybody who goes around thinking that, you know, he's trying to find ways that they won't be saved really has the very wrong impression, and they're listening to the wrong person. You know, how do I know that God exists? Now, a lot of people in the scientific community say, you know, God, that's for weaklings. That's for people who can't think. That's for people who can't intellectualize things for themselves. Now, of course, these are the very same people who say our universe came together as a result of some big bang, and all of a sudden everything was perfectly organized. I mean, and they're the same people who say that there are theories of thermodynamics, like the second law of thermodynamics, which is entropy, which says things move toward a state of disorganization. So now how can things move toward a state of disorganization, and yet there's a big bang and everything becomes completely organized? You know, that requires more faith than I have, you know? I just don't have that much faith. But how else do I know he exists? By things that happen in your life. You know, I remember when I was a young attending neurosurgeon, there was a little 4-year-old girl, and she got hit by a Good Humor ice cream truck. And it was a devastating injury. She was brought into the intensive care unit. She was intubated. And I remember when I came in to assess the situation, and I said, are her pupils working? And they said, yes, they are. And I raised the lid and I looked, and the pupil was dilated, and it was fixed. And the other one wasn't quite yet, but while we were standing there, it became fixed and dilated. And I said, we got to take this girl to the operating room immediately. I just said to a couple of the nurses and some of the ICU associates, I said, grab the bed, just grab the bed, we're going to the OR. We don't have time to call them, we're just going to the OR. And we went to the OR, we announced we were there, we said, where's an empty room? We're going in there, bring the stuff, we're gonna operate. On the way there, I ran into one of the neurosurgery professors, a very well-known individual, particularly in the area of trauma. I told him what I was doing. He said, you're nuts. He said, you're wasting your time. It's too late. It's the end of the story. Well, we operated on that little girl, and we took off her bone, and we opened the dura, and we put patches in there so that the brain could expand. And I'll tell you, today she is a very happy young mother. Oh, well. So that's how I know God exists. You know, in 1987, when we did the Bender twins, occipital-craniopagus twins joined at the back of the head. Never had anyone been able to separate twins like that with both surviving because of the complexity. Well, we were able to separate them. They both survived. And I got to tell you, in 1997, when we did the Banda twins, type 2 vertical craniopagus, joined at the top of the head facing in opposite direction, that had never been done before with both being intact. Both of those kids are now in the 2nd grade and doing perfectly fine. Now, how does that tell me that God is alive and well? Simple. I know me. And I know that I'm not that smart. You know? Now, I am smart, but I'm not that smart. I'm not so smart that I can do stuff that people who are incredibly bright have been trying to do and couldn't do. And that's why I know that there's a God. And I know that when I pray to him and I ask him for wisdom and I ask him for guidance, that he's willing to give it if I believe in him. And that makes a big difference. And next week at this time, we will probably be in the operating room trying to separate another set of twins. We're going to start next Saturday morning. We're using a lot of very, very fancy equipment, and we're trying some new techniques. But I want to ask each one of you to make sure that you include that in your prayers next Saturday. And I am a firm believer that if God is hearing the petitions from all of us, that he will grant us that wish. And again, it will not be the fact that I'm a great surgeon or that I've surrounded myself by a great team, because I've come to understand who the great physician is. And if we put our faith in him, there's no limit to what we can do. Well, I need to close because I'm beyond my hour now. But let me just skip ahead very rapidly to the state of medicine. I've talked a little bit about what was going on with neurosurgery. I talked a little bit about what's going on with obstetrics. But the fact of the matter is, medicine is still a wonderful career because we have the opportunity to intervene in people's lives. People put the most precious thing that they have into our hands, and we're able to give them longevity and quality of life, and there is no other career that gives you those kinds of rewards. So it is still a wonderful area to go into, and I would encourage anybody who's thinking about it to do it. You know, you think about the last turn of the century. In this country, the average lifespan was 47 years. Now we've added about another 40 years to that. That is an incredible statement for what medicine is able to do. Now what we have to do is get medicine to start thinking about preventive health care. And that's where we begin to save money. Do we really want preventive health care? Why is it taking us so long to come down on cigarettes? Why haven't we come down on alcohol the way we should? Why haven't we come down on pollution in our environment the way that we should? The pollution we find in our houses the way we should. All of these things continue to maintain disease in our society. And you know, if we really begin to come down on these things the way we should, if we begin to clean up the environment the way we should, think about all the positive ramifications. You know, one of the worst things in our environment, one of the worst pollutants is petroleum and petroleum-derived products. And if we decided we want to get rid of all the petroleum in our society and petroleum base, and we could clean up all of that stuff that gets in and that is non-biodegradable, but more importantly, we dry up all the funds for Osama bin Laden and all the terrorists. And we get rid of them too. So, you know, there is a positive effect from cleaning up our environment. We can clean up more things than just the pollutants. We can also clean up the terrorists. But we need to start thinking that way. And that way, we're not necessarily shooting people. We're not necessarily bombing people. And we're not necessarily continuing to agitate the situation, because if we really want to be realistic about it, we do have to realize that we're never going to give up, and they're never going to give up. So if it's just a matter of shooting bombs and missiles and trying to terrorize each other, that's going to go on forever. And we need to come up with better, more creative ways. You know, we need to look to God to give us the wisdom. And you know, this is a time in our existence that we need to make sure that we do not listen to those people who think that we should throw God out of our society. This is definitely not the time to be doing that. That relationship to God is the most important thing that we can have. It's the thing that keeps our nation strong. And I want to close by giving you one story about how active God is. Some people say, you know, I read these stories in the Bible about how God, you know, gave sight to the blind, or hearing to the deaf, or raised the dead. Well, a number of years ago, a young couple came to me with their little daughter, and she had craniosynostosis. Her skull was not growing, her brain was, so you could see there was a problem there. So we decided we would do a cranial expansion. Well, while we were in the operating room operating, you know, one of my assistants noticed that the anesthesiologist was getting a little fidgety, and she said, is there a problem? And the anesthesiologist said, we're having a little problem with the blood pressure. So we very quickly had to close and flip the patient over, and they started CPR. And, you know, 5 minutes went by, and they weren't getting anything. 10 minutes, nothing. 15 minutes, 20 minutes. Finally, they looked at me, and they said, I think we've lost the child. I think it's time to quit. And I said, it's not time to quit yet. I haven't finished praying yet. And I said, Lord, you got to do something here. You see, this was the only child that this family had. She was an absolute apple of their eye. And I wasn't ready to quit. So they kept going. And finally, we got a little beep on the EKG monitor, and then we got, you know, a regular rhythm back, and we got her back into the intensive care unit, and we were kind of enthusiastic, but I remember when I was, by the time we were able to do a neurologic exam, it became clear that she was fixed and dilated, both pupils, after the anesthesia had worn off. She had no neurologic exam whatsoever. She was brain dead. And, you know, I went in to talk to the family. And, of course, I had to relay that news to them. And they were devastated. Can you imagine? Let me tell you something. I would rather, you know, take a machine gun and go out and fight Iraqis than to have to go in and tell somebody news like that. But, you know, it's part of the job. And they were so devastated, and they were so desperate, and they said, Doctor, is there a 10% chance that she could live? No. 1%? No. Well, the father then challenged me. He said, I know you're a Christian. I'm a Christian. Let's see who can pray the hardest about this. So we agreed that we would both go and we would pray as hard as we could. And do you know, within 24 hours, that little baby's pupils started working. And she started moving around. And it was an amazing thing. And everybody was talking about this. It was absolutely fabulous. We couldn't believe it. I was on cloud 9. And the next day, the baby started having problems with the lungs. Respiratory distress syndrome. Areas of the lungs started rupturing, multiple pneumothoraces. And by the time the day was over, the pulmonologist said that baby had less than a 5% chance of surviving the night. And I said, what? I said, Lord, what's going on here? I said, you were looking pretty good for a while there. I said, I can't understand. How could this be happening? And I remember I went on home. I had to go to Ohio the next day to speak at one of the medical schools. And I was leaving very early that morning. And my youngest son had a severe asthma attack, and my wife had to take him to the local emergency room. And then I got a call from Hopkins that the last working segment of the baby's lung had ruptured and that the baby was going to die imminently, and could I come in before I left for the airport just to comfort the family. And as I got my clothes on to get ready to go to the hospital, I got a call from the local hospital saying they couldn't get my son's asthma under control. And I made arrangements for him to be transferred by ambulance to Hopkins, and by the time I got done with all that, I had to go to the airport. And as soon as I got to the airport, I called the ICU to see if I could catch the parents before they left, assuming that the child was dead. And the doctor said the child is not dead. In fact, the child has rallied. And the child is making respiratory progress. And when I got back that night, I went to the hospital and I checked on my son, and then I went and checked on that little baby, and the lungs were starting to work. They had put on a special type of jet ventilator. And after a week or so on that ventilator, the baby came off, the lungs were fully functional. But now the neurologists and the rehab people were saying that this baby is not a candidate for rehab because she can't see, she can't hear, she's not going to have much in the way of neurological function, she's not going to develop in a normal way, and it would be a waste of time. And I remember I was heading off to California to do some site reviews for NIH. And I was there for 3 days, and when I came back, I went to that child's room. And do you know, when I walked in there, that child looked at me and followed me across the room. And that child could clearly hear. And it turned out that the rehab specialist and the neurologist were correct. She was not a candidate for rehab because she was perfectly normal and went home as a normal child. So does that tell you anything about whether God exists or not? You know, he is just as active today as he was in the past. And, you know, I don't worry about when people are naysayers. I got involved in lots of things early in my career so that, you know, I wasn't just spending my time in the laboratory and in the operating rooms. I was doing a lot of things with young people, and people were saying to me, you can't do that in academic medicine. You'll never progress, and you'll never be tenured, and you'll never be a full professor. Well, I've been a full professor for several years now in several different disciplines with multiple academic awards, 38 honorary doctorate degrees. I've gotten to know all kinds of people. About the only thing I haven't achieved is an endowed chair, and the Lord may have that on the way one of these days too. So, you know, I don't worry when people say, you can't do this, and you can't do that, because I know that if I put my hand in his hand, I can do anything. And you can too. And that is the key. And we need to make sure that we don't listen to the naysayers and those people who want to throw God out. Recognize that there is something very special about this nation and the people that comprise this nation and the struggles that they have had and the position that they hold in the world today. And when people say, get God out, do they realize that our Declaration of Independence, our founding document, talks about certain inalienable rights that our Creator, a.k.a. God, endowed us with? That the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag talks about the fact that we are one nation under God. That most courtrooms in the land on the wall, it says, in God we trust. Every coin in our pocket, every bill in our wallet says, in God we trust. So if it's in our founding documents, it's in our pledge, it's in our courts, it's on our money, but we're not supposed to talk about it, what in the world is that? In medicine, it's called schizophrenia. And that explains a lot of things, does it not? You know, when the Continental Congress got together the first time, terrible rancor about to split apart the young union because the small states and the large states had different agendas. And Benjamin Franklin said, gentlemen, stop fighting. Let's get down on our knees and let's seek wisdom from God. And they got down on their knees and they prayed. And when they got up, they resolved their differences and our union was born. And we need to make it absolutely clear that there's nothing wrong with living by godly principles of caring about your fellow man, of loving your neighbor, of developing your God-given talents to the utmost so that you become valuable to the people around you, of having values and principles that govern your life. And if we do that, we truly will have one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, and may God bless you.